and may, from now on, may it be a wonderful year. And Shoshi, I have a little surprise for you. We got an anonymous donation for 1,200 euros.
Wow.
So we have a very wonderful base, but obviously everybody is invited to contribute. And
Hello.
what are you contributing to? Could everybody mute themselves, please? It's a little hard to speak against the background noises. So we are currently fundraising for our, we in WIZO Germany call it the WIZO Safety Campaign. In Israel, it's called Safety Net. And here you see all the pertinent information with obviously also the bank data in case you feel compelled to contribute. WIZO Safety is a campaign for victims of domestic violence. Unfortunately, we had a global major increase in domestic violence. Israel is a country that has always been very protective, very active, and WIZO is at the forefront. And I'm very, very proud to say that WIZO reacted instantaneously. There was much higher demand for the shelters, but obviously there aren't too many shelters, not only WIZO shelters, but shelters run by other organizations or the welfare department. And the way WIZO handled the actual rise at the outbreak of Corona was by working together very closely with the welfare ministry and providing a WIZO institution that was not active in times of Corona. And we are able to host 12 mothers and their children. And the mothers are already treated there and they get therapy. They just have opportunities to relax and recover. The kids are entertained by volunteers. And one of the mothers said, it feels like the first time in paradise. Most of us know the institution, we cannot name it. It's a wonderful place, and we really hope that this is the first step for these people, for these mothers and their children, to a better future. On top of this institution, WIZO runs four therapy centers all across the country, where women who are already let out of the shelters and who are beginning a new life, independent life, but they still need therapy, they need financial help, much more so now during Corona times or post-Corona times, whatever we may call it. And as I said before, WIZO is at the forefront. WIZO is running 3 shelters across the country, but obviously there is more need for this, and we are really hoping to make an impact. And I don't know, Esther, if you want to add something. And Esther, I would also like to welcome you. It's a great privilege to have the World WIZO President with us, that you took your time. And I think, Avi, unless Esther wants to add something, I would say the floor is yours, and thanks to everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicole. Can you hear me? Yes. I just wanted to say that you are really doing great work, WIZO Germany, and thank you so much. First of all, a big happy birthday to Shoshi. It was Shoshi that reminded me today that I had to be on this. Thank you very much, Shoshi. It's going to be very interesting, and really, WIZO Germany is top notch. Really, we get so much help from WIZO Germany. I don't know how we would have managed through this Corona with our women here that are being abused. This big thing that happened through WIZO Israel, it's really a safety net. It is for the women, and thank you, really. Everything you all do, we appreciate it very much. And I'm sure today's presentation of Mr. Avi Melamed will be excellent. I'm looking forward to hearing him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Shalom from Israel. Here it's an evening time, so I would say good evening, at least from Israel. Nicole, thank you for your opening remarks. Great job, very inspiring. Esther, thank you for joining this session. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Adi for helping us with all the logistics and the technology. And obviously, finally, I want to thank Shoshana for providing me this opportunity and this stage, and to wish you this opportunity a happy Hebrew date of birthday. Ladies and gentlemen, shalom, I'm very honored to be with you. Let us get to business. And you may be able to see, I hope that you can see in front of you the title of my presentation, Israel and the Challenge of the Shi'ite Crescent. Can you all see that? It's clear? Excellent. Indeed, we're going to talk about something which is enormously significant, particularly these days, very relevant. So let's dive in. But, you know, like any other good story, I want to start with the famous sentence, once upon a time. And I'm going to start with something that basically goes back to ancient history, but it's very relevant to our times. And I'm going back some 1400 years ago. The 7th century when Islam emerged and very quickly turning into a conquering empire. And very quickly also experiencing an inner split between two major camps. And the split is about, obviously, political power. To make a long story short, this is kind of like a framing. There are two camps in Islam. Ones are known as Sunnis, which are majority of the Muslims, and the other camp, the minority, are known as Shiite. The story goes back to the 7th century when the 4th king, ruler of the Muslim empire, his name was Ali bin Abi Talib. He was the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad. He was married to 9 women. His first wife was Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, and together they had 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. Ali was assassinated and his older son Hassan took his place as the king, the caliph, and then he stepped down. The younger son, Al-Hussein, said, my brother was the caliph, my father was the caliph, I'm the next one in line. His political opponent says, well, sir, with all due respect, Islam is not about dynasty, it's about the most suitable man for the position. The conflict quickly turned into violence, and in the year 680, Al-Hussein bin Ali, the last direct male grandson of Prophet Muhammad, was butchered with his followers in a place called Kerbela. This is Iraq of our times. And this is the times where Islam split. Majority of the Muslims are Sunnis, and the Sunnis are saying, leading the Muslim world is not about bloodline. It's not about dynasty. It's about the most suitable man for the position. The minority, roughly speaking, some 15% of the Muslims today, are known by the name of Shiites. The full term is Shi'at Ali, the political faction of Ali. And the Shiites, that they are minority in Islam, say no. Only a direct male descendant of Ali, the 4th caliph, is entitled to lead the Muslim world. So this is the core of the split between Sunnis and Shiites in Islam. For 1400 years, the theological, political, narrative gaps between the two camps are non-breachable. The deepest narratives of the Shiites is the one that says, we, the Shiites, we were supposed to lead the Muslim world. The crown of leadership was taken from us in 680 by the loathed Muslim Sunnis. One day will come and we will take it back. And the day, maybe in the eyes of the Shiites, have come, and now I'm moving to our times. 1979, a very significant event happens in Iran. Iran that used to be ruled by the dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty. Now in 1979, there is a revolution in Iran. Iran becomes an Islamic theocracy under the leadership of what is known as the mullahs regime. You may hear the term mullahs. Mullahs is the Shiite clergies. There are orders, ranks, like in the army. One of the highest positions of the Shiite clergies is known by the name of Ayatollah. You may hear this term, Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is not his name, this is his rank. It's one of the highest positions within the Islamic clergies. Ayatollah Khomeini is leading this Islamic revolution in 1979. And in 1979, Iran becomes Shiite theocracy under the leadership of the Mullah's regime. The Mullah regime is ideologically motivated by the deepest narratives of the Shiites, and on top of them, the narrative that I mentioned before, meaning we Shiites, we were supposed to lead the Muslim world, but the crown was taken from us in 680. When the Mullah regime came to power in Iran in 1979, the Mullah regime says, it is our time now to start moving forward to take back the crown of leadership that was taken from us in 680. Not so many years passed since the Mullah regime came to power in Iran in 1979. And in 2004, King Abdullah II, the king of Jordan, made a very interesting statement, sort of a prophecy, but he was really right. In December 2004, King Abdullah said, beware of the Shi'ite Crescent in the Middle East. If you look right in front of you, you could see the map of the Middle East, parts of the Middle East, and you could see this yellow line that stands for the Shi'ite Crescent that King Abdullah II was talking about. You could see that this crescent is crossing all the way, starting in the Mediterranean Sea, right here, crossing from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, going towards the Gulf. This is the Arab or the Persian Gulf, crossing through Bahrain, continuing to Yemen, and entering to Africa. This is the crescent, the Shiite crescent that King Abdullah was alarming, talking about already back in 2004. And this is the essence of what we are going to talk about in our discussion today in the context of Israel's geostrategic environment. The idea beyond the Shiite crescent was to expand the control and the rule of the Mullah regime in the Middle East as part of the vision of a Shiite hegemony. That mission was appointed to a specific power, force within the Mullah regime, and this is a force that is known by the name of Al-Quds force. Al-Quds is a word in Arabic. This is the Arabic name of Jerusalem. It comes from Hebrew, Hakdosha, the sacred, the holy. Shortly, we'll see why that name was particularly picked by the Persians, because they don't speak Arabic. There was a very good reason why they chosen that name. The task of exporting the Islamic revolution was appointed to Al-Quds force and his legendary leader, commander, Major General Qasem Soleimani. You could see him on the upper picture right here. Under the leadership of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the regime was developing a model of expansion in the Middle East that basically centers around very simple and very effective code or model, if you wish. And this is the idea of finding, either by creating, establishing, or by identifying proxies in different parts of the Middle East that could be very useful in the service of the vision of the Shi'ite Crescent. Shortly, we will be familiar with some of those proxies. The gentleman that you see in the lower part of the picture is the current leader of the Al-Quds force. His name is General Ismail Qani, and he replaced Major General Soleimani, who was killed in January 3rd, 2020, a couple of months ago, by the United States of America in Iraq. There were two major mechanisms that were helping the mullahs regime to expand their influence in the Middle East since they came to power. You know, 40 years has passed since the mullah regime came to power in 1979 in Iran. Today, the leaders of Iran are saying, we control 4 Arab capitals. We control Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. We control Damascus, the capital of Syria. We control Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. We control Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. It is not necessarily an exaggeration. The mullah regime was able in 40 years' time to basically expand its influence to the point Lebanon, for example, became an Iranian satellite. Syria is physically partly occupied by the Iranian. Iraq is very much controlled and influenced by the Iranians. The same applies as for Yemen. What enabled the mullah regime in such short period of time to actually expand its control to the point it really impact and influence the domestic and security and foreign policy of some Arab states that I mentioned before? There were two major platforms that were playing very well to the hands of the mullah regime. One was the failure of the concept of statehood in the Middle East. To make a long story short, the people of the Middle East were introduced to the concept of nationalism and statehood in the 20th century. When you look today, in 2020, you basically see that almost all across the region, the story of statehood in the Middle East is an utterly failure. Tunisia and Algeria are struggling enormously. Libya is collapsing in a civil war. Egypt is struggling enormously. Lebanon is in the verge of a total collapse. Syria is ruined. Iraq is struggling enormously. Violence, corruption. Yemen is ruined. The picture repeats itself time and again. The story of statehood in the Middle East is an utterly failure. That played very well to the hands of the mullah regime, because whenever there is a place where the government is weak, where there is a constant political instability and violence, and in places where in addition to that, you also have presence of Shiites, that's a good place for the mullah regime to move in and to expand its control and influence. So the weakness of statehood in the Middle East, and particularly in the Arab world, was one of the platforms that the mullah regime was very effectively using to expand its influence. And then there is another significant factor or platform that very well used by the mullah regime to expand its influence, and this is a specific conflict in the Middle East, known by the name of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of many conflicts in the Middle East, and definitely not the most central one. I know there is a tendency in the world to look at the Middle East as if it's only the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is not the case. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict in its dimensions, background, outcomes is nothing in comparison to other huge conflicts in the Middle East. However, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very much present in the mindset of people of the Middle East. The Palestinians are Sunnis, they are not Shiites. Again, I will reiterate. The Palestinians, like majority of the Muslims in the world, are Sunnis. They are not Shiites. However, the mullah regime, understanding how significant the conflict is in the mindset of the people of the Middle East, who obviously are predominantly Sunni Muslims, the mullah regime did something very simple. The mullah regime positioned itself as the defender of the Palestinians in that conflict, knowing that by doing that, the mullah regime will harvest political dividends among the people of the Middle East. And not less important, by doing that, the mullah regime will be able to bypass the suspicious, not to say the resentment of most of the Arabs in the Middle East towards the mullah regime, because the mullah regime is Persian Shiite, while the Arabs are Arabs and most of them are Sunnis. Indeed, that calculation seems to be very accurate. I mean, the mullah regime, by positioning himself as the defender of the Palestinians, indeed was able to harvest political dividends. And the mullah regime was doing it very sophisticatedly by creating a network of proxies and agents across the Middle East under a title, a code word that became very present in the terminology and dictionary of the Middle East. And that word is, I use it in Arabic and then I will translate, al-muqawama. The meaning of that word is the resistance. The mullah regime has been establishing axis of proxies and agents under the title of the resistance axis, محور المقاومة. This is in Arabic. And basically, this is the acronym for the concept that says the state of Israel must be eliminated through violence. Why the state of Israel has to be eliminated? Because according to that outlook, Israel is a foreign entity that was implanted in the body of the Middle East by the Western colonialistic powers. Israel is allegedly not indigenous to the Middle East, and therefore Israel has to be outroot. There should be no concessions, no recognition, no negotiations, no nothing. And the mullah regime is the spearhead of this concept, of this approach under the title of the axis of resistance. In the time since the mullah regime came to power in 1979, he was, unfortunately, very successfully developing networks of proxies and agents centered around the concept of the resistance. Here is the most well-known proxy of the mullah regime, based in an Arab state called Lebanon, bordering Israel from the north, a Lebanese Shiite organization called Hezbollah. The Hezbollah in Lebanon is mostly based on the Shiite population in Lebanon. The Shiite population in Lebanon is one of the biggest sects in Lebanon. The Iranians established the Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982, taking advantage of the fact that Lebanon suffered constant political instability, taking advantage of the fact that Israel occupied parts of Lebanon between 1982 until 2000 for 18 years. The mullah regime identified Lebanon as a great place to go in because Lebanon is located offshore the Mediterranean. So the mullah regime established in the beginning of the 80s political power in Lebanon called Hezbollah. The Iranians arms the Hezbollah with the best weapons they can afford, rockets, missiles, and so on. The Iranians financed the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And basically what happened was in time that the Hezbollah became a state within a state in Lebanon, to the point that the Hezbollah, which is independent Iranian weapon, basically took Lebanon from within as a hostage and subdue Lebanon to the interest of the Iranians. Lebanon has a government, it has a president, it has a prime minister, it has army, it has court, it has political parties. Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese government, but the real decision of Lebanons are not made in Beirut. They are made in Tehran, and the executor of those decisions is the Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is how Lebanon was taken from within by the Hezbollah in the service of the Iranians. When the Lebanese turned to the Hezbollah and asked him to disarm himself, saying, we have a country, we have an army, we have a government, we can't have a parallel army, the Hezbollah's reply was, don't you dare touching this weapon. This is the weapon of the resistance. It's a holy weapon, and this is the weapon that will shield Lebanon against the Zionist aggression. The Hezbollah today has missiles and rocket capacities that only few states in the world has. Some 130, maybe more, 150,000 rockets, missiles. Most of them are inaccurate. But one of the things that the Hezbollah and the Iranian are working very hard to achieve is to make those rockets and missiles precise, and they are all aimed at the state of Israel, targeting Israel's cities, infrastructure, airbase, and so on and so on. So this is one component of this axis that the Iranians were able to create in such short period of time, less than 40 years in power. In Syria, the Iranian basically occupies parts of Syria. It's being done mostly through a network of, again, Iranian-backed militias, Hezbollah from Lebanon, Iraqi militias that are Shiites. They are Iraqis, but they are obeying Iran. Afghan militias, Pakistanis militias. They are in Syria, fighting with Assad regime to keep Assad regime in power, because Syria is enormously significant component in the Iranian Shi'ite Crescent. Why is that? Because the weapons that Iran sent to the Hezbollah going through Syria. In Syria, there are factories that are producing more rockets and weapons that goes to the Hezbollah. Syria hosts major camps and military camps where thousands of Shiite militants are training. Some of them are doing advanced military training in Iran and goes back to wherever they come from. Shortly, we'll see an example. Syria is an enormous component in this structure that the Iranians were building in the last 30 or 34 years in the region, under the title of the Crescent, or the axis of resistance. And that explains the fact why Iran has been involved in the war in Syria ever since day one, because the downfall of Assad regime in Syria would have been a very bad news to the Iranians. Assad regime in Syria is a very significant partner for the Iranians. If Assad would have gone down, that is a bad news for the Iranians. That is a bad news for their hegemony vision. That is a bad news for the story of the Shi'ite Crescent. So the Iranians has significant presence in Lebanon, the Hezbollah. They have a significant armed militant presence in Syria. Shortly, we'll go to see some very significant component of that. In Iraq, the same story. The mullah's regime was able to take advantage of the fact that the largest community in Iraq are Shiites. Like Lebanon, like Syria, Iraq is a crumbling state. The rise of ISIS in the rise of ISIS in Iraq in 2006, and then robustly in 2013 and 14, was a great opportunity for the Iranians to increase their influence in Iraq. What happened was that under the title of fighting ISIS in Iraq, the Iranians were able to create an axis network of Iraqi Shiite militias that are known by the name of the Popular Mobilizations Units. We are talking about thousands of Iraqi Shiites, mostly, massively armed and trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. They were fighting against ISIS in Iraq until they were able to crush ISIS' stronghold in Iraq. For the Iranians, that was a big bonus because through that, the Iranians basically deepened their control over Iraq. The people that you see in the picture, the one to the left, is not any longer with us. His name was Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He was the second in command in this PMU, Popular Mobilization Units. He was killed together with Major General Qasem Soleimani in the US attack in January 3rd, 2020. The person you see to the right is a person called Falah Fayyad. He is he's one of the major leaders. I'm sorry, this is another person. His name is Hadi al-Amiri. He is a leader of a very significant militia power as part of the PMU. Again, he is with us, but he is acting as an Iranian proxy. Similar to what we saw in Lebanon, something similar happened in Iraq. The Iranians were able to actually take Iraq over from within using local Iraqi Shiite powers to basically gain growing influence on the ground. Another state is Yemen. In 2014, a Yemenite-based Shiite tribes called Houthis. They are about 35% of the population, mostly located in the northern part of Yemen, bordering Saudi Arabia. This is Saudi Arabia, this is Yemen. The Houthis launched a coup in 2014, ousting Yemenite government. The Houthis, this is their leader, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, are massively supported by the Iranians. The same model like Hezbollah, like the Iraqi militias, arms, weapons, missiles, rockets, and so on and so on. The Houthis basically offer the Iranians sort of a stronghold in one of the most significant strategic locations on earth. This is Yemen that sits on the strategic passage of Bab el-Mandeb that connects the Red Sea. This is the Red Sea, the Arab Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. By getting stronghold in Yemen, the Mullah regime is making a significant step towards realization of the concept of the Shi'ite Crescent that I mentioned before. Let me just go very shortly, briefly back and show you again this crescent. Now you could visualize that following what I say. Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria controlled by the Iranians, partly occupied by the Iranians, Iraq, Popular Mobilizations Unit, the Shiites militias in Iraq, the Gulf, Yemen, this is Bab el-Mandab, this is the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf. Now you could visualize how this crescent is materializing, has been materializing in the last 40 years under the control of the Mullah's regime. And another place you may be familiar with called the Gaza Strip, located in the southwest of Israel between Israel and Egypt. Right here, you could see that right here. The Gaza Strip controlled by an Islamist Palestinian militant group that is called Hamas. Hamas is a word in Arabic which means a religious enthusiasm. It's also the initials of the Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyah, the Islamic resistance movement. And Hamas, massively supported by the Iranians, took over Gaza Strip in a violent coup in 2007. Reminding you, Israel withdrew from Gaza Strip in 2005, handing it over to the Palestinian Authority. A year and a half later, Hamas, who was born in Gaza Strip, who is based in Gaza Strip, massively armed by the Iranians, conducted a coup crushing the control of the Palestinian Authority in a violent coup and took over Gaza Strip. Like Lebanon, Gaza Strip also to a large extent became a stronghold for the Iranians offshore the Mediterranean Sea. There is another significant military power in Hamas, in Gaza Strip, second to Hamas. It's called Islamic Jihad in Palestine. This is their logo. This is the Hamas logo. Islamic Jihad in Palestine, like Hamas, massively supported by the Iranians, the second largest military organization. Like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the concept is the same concept. Create or develop proxy on the ground, massively arms that proxy, make sure that this proxy will have the military power to impose its will on the ground. And then there is, of course, another significant common denominators when you look at what I mentioned before, meaning when you look at Syria, Lebanon, and you look at Gaza Strip, the common denominator is that they are all bordering Israel. And that basically reveals master plan of the mullah's regime. The master plan of the mullah regime is to create a strong loop around Israel's neck. The two edges of that loop exists. One is in Lebanon, bordering Israel from the north. One is in Gaza Strip, bordering Israel from the southeast, from the southwest. Syria is supposed to be the part that continue and basically complete that loop. So this is Syria, here is Lebanon. The idea is to create, you could see here my cursor, I'm using it, to create this loop around Israel's neck. A loop that will be composed of hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles, targeting Israeli cities, communities, infrastructure, together with the deployment of thousands of Shi'ite militants, Hezbollah, Iraqi, Afghan, Pakistani militias that are already in Syria, and of course, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other groups in Gaza. Basically, the master plan of the Iranian is to create this strangling loop around Israel's neck, and it has a purpose. According to the master plan of the Iranians, the original blueprint was that in the year 2025, Israel will cease to exist. Now there has been an update. The mullah regime has postponed that, and now they are talking about 2050. How do I know that? Because the Iranian regime is saying that openly, overtly. And so Israel faces this enormous challenge of this strangling loop that the mullah regime strives to create. Part of that already exists in Lebanon and in Gaza, around Israel's neck. What you see here is an example of the way that the mullah regime has been so well monetizing the story of the "we are defenders of the Palestinians." The mullah regime couldn't care less about the Palestinians. But the issue of the Palestinians and defending the Palestinians is a great pawn used by the mullah regime. So what you see here, for example, is a poster that recently published by the Iranian regime. And if you could see, you could identify this is actually the Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem. This is the Dome of the Rock. And the figures that you see here with different numbers represents different figures that are all part of this axis of resistance. These are all subcontractors of the mullah regime. For example, number one is the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. The second one, number two, is Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas. Number four is the leader of Islamic Jihad in Palestine. Number seven right here is Ismail Qani, the new leader of the Al-Quds force. And notice here, number 10, in a shape of a cloud in the sky, is the late leader of Al-Quds force, Major General Qasem Soleimani, that was eliminated by the United States in January 2020. This is a way, or one of the ways, that the mullah regime has been monetizing very effectively the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the service of the mullah's regime crescent, Shi'ite Crescent hegemony vision. A very significant milestone, and unfortunately very not good one, was in 2015 with the signing of the JCPOA. This is the Iran deal, dealing with the story of the Iranian attempts to achieve a nuclear military capacities. Following that deal that actually supposedly supposed to end the Iranians' attempts to get nuclear weapons, which of course didn't happen, the mullah regime basically boosted its aggression in different parts of the Middle East. The agreement of the JCPOA, unfortunately, played very well to the hands of the Iranian regime hegemony vision. Following that agreement, the mullah regime has boosted its aggression, particularly in the Gulf area right here, in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab Strait, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. The whole aggression of the Iranian was tripled following the signing of the JCPOA. And in the context of Israel, one of the most significant development is the fact that the mullah regime, taking advantage of the infrastructure, the military infrastructure that he present or established in Syria, in Lebanon, in 2018, for the first time ever, the mullah regime directly attacked Israel from Syria. Not by proxies, but directly. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards launched an attack drone from Syria to Israeli territory. The outcome of that was a day of a combat between Israel and Iranians and Iranian proxies in Syria, a one-day clashes. And basically, ever since, what we have witnessed in Syria is a very clear story. The Iranian regime is trying to establish and expand its military infrastructure in Syria, and Israel is acting openly, hundreds of times, to intercept the Iranian attempt to create military infrastructure in Syria that will be presenting, if established, a very severe threat to the state of Israel. In that sense, the story of Syria and the challenge that Iran presents to Israel is enormously significant because the Iranians are striving to create a land corridor, not only an aerial corridor, which already exists, but a land corridor that connects Iran. You could see Iran right here, through Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon. And that land corridor will stream missiles, militants, weapons, and ammunition to Syria, hence to complete the strangling loop around Israel's neck. A very significant component in this plan of the Iranian is basically located in a base next to the Syrian-Iraqi borders. Let me show you this place and say a few words about it. What you see right in front of you is a satellite image of the area of the Iraqi-Syrian border. I don't know if you could see, there is this pink line right here. This is the line that stands for the border. This is Iraq.
Avi, we don't see.
You don't see? Okay, got it. I'll do it again, and hopefully now you could see. Just a moment. Can you see it now? No, you can't see that?
We just see the no, the website, the address of the web.
You don't see the image?
No.
Got it.
Can you put it in your browser? Just open it up in your.
I'll try to put it elsewhere and see if we could see it. We could see it from a different location. If not, we'll just move on.
Or just
PowerPoint.
yeah. What's the PowerPoint? Maybe you just go to the internet and type in the address and go directly to the internet, because we just see the PowerPoint presentation. If you open it in here.
Yeah, let me try and open it here and I'll see if you could see that. Just a moment.
Yeah, then you should just be able to share your screen again. You didn't share this. Oh, yeah, there.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. So this is the borderline between Syria, right here to the left, and Iraq to the right. What you see right here is the passage, the border passage. It's a place called Kain. What I want you to focus is here. I'll move to the left-hand side, crossing the border to Syria. We just crossed the border, and I want you to notice this area. I'm zooming in, you could see that. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is a compound, it's called Imam Ali compound. This is a military compound that was established by the Iranians. Again, noticed, it is inside Syria, very close to the Iraqi-Syrian border. And since the Iranians has controlled significant influence in Iraq, they basically could make sure that they could stream weapons and ammunitions from the Iraqi-Syrian border, from El Qaim, right here. They could stream it right to this place, Imam Ali. This is a logistical transition point, if you wish. And then from here, the idea is to continue and to ship missiles, weapons, whatever, into Syria. Now, if I'll go back to the presentation, we could now, once we saw this compound that I showed you, the compound of Imam Ali, now we could see how the rest comes to part when we look at the presentation of the presentation that I'm showing you. Can you see the presentation? Can you see that?
Yes, we see.
Excellent. So now you see, I'm going back. Now we saw the passage from Iraq to Syria. Okay, we just saw this passage from Iraq to Syria. This is the place I showed you. This is the passage. And the Iranian compound is located right here. This is Syria. Okay, this is Iraq. Now, the Iranians are trying to move the weapons, to stream the weapons in different paths west towards Lebanon, to the western part of Syria. The major route that they basically could use today is the one that goes from here, from the passage with Iraq, and continuing, crossing the Syrian desert. This is a desert area. Crossing the Syrian desert, this is Damascus right here. That's the major route that the Iranian can try and to ship, to send their weapons and ammunition. The other routes that you see right here are less relevant because it's a much more difficult, for different reasons, for the Iranians to use those routes. But here, this is a major route that the Iranians are trying to transfer the weapons and ammunition. More than often, you hear about attacks that happens in remote parts of Syria, particularly the eastern part of Syria, right? Those attacks are not by chance. They are targeting the efforts of the Iranians to stream in convoys of weapons and ammunitions to Syria as part of their attempt to create the strangling loop around Israel's neck, Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza Strip. Finally, once we get this big picture and understand the Iranian blueprint or master plan, now we can understand why Israel openly says and act. Israel say we will not enable the Iranians to establish a military infrastructure in Syria because that will present an enormous significant danger to the state of Israel. And in that context, one last thing that I want to show you before we'll move to questions, Q's and A's. Again, I hope that you could see that. If not, I'll do the copy. This is, let me know if you just see that. Can you see the YouTube? No,
no,
so I'll copy it. All
it.
right, I'll copy it and
yeah, we see, that's the link of the YouTube.
You see that? You see the movie?
We don't see the YouTube itself. We just see your presentation.
Got it. So I'll upload it in a minute, and you could see that in a different connection. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to share it. Right. Just a moment. I have to share it with you. Let's do share screen. Can you see it now?
Yes.
This is documentation of an Israeli attack on a surface-to-air batteries in Syria, part of the attempts of the Iranians to establish this infrastructure. This is another documentation, another attack, Israeli attack. What you see here, the black smoke, is the rockets launched from this battery as they are trying to intercept the Israeli attack. Obviously, they failed, as you could see. Shortly, you could see the impact of the attack. And this is part of what is going on in Syria for the last couple of years. So to go back to my general presentation, I hope that in spite of the details and so on, you were able to get the picture and understand the complexity of the challenge that Israel is dealing with. Reminding you, we are talking about the story of the Iranian Shi'ite Crescent and what is known as the northern challenge or the northern front of Israel, and the challenge that Israel has to deal with that. It goes back to the beginning of my presentation, the title of my presentation, Israel and the Challenges of the Shi'ite Crescent. And that is part of the big story of Israel's northern, what is known as Israel's northern front challenge. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm opening the session for your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Avi. It was very interesting. And yeah, so please let me know if you have questions or raise your hand. I have already one question. First of all, really interesting, but my question is, after hearing all that and knowing what you said and experiencing it, I was wondering, do you think, how will Israel's future look like? Do you think we are strong enough? I mean, like after your presentation, I kind of get a feeling that we have to deal with a really big fear.
Look, Israel is in a very tough neighborhood. We all know that. We see what happens around Israel. We talked right now about the story of the Iranians and the challenge they present Israel. This is a very serious challenge. Israel is very powerful, but the only way you can survive in this neighborhood is that if you are being powerful. Just the same, the challenges are significant. It's not only about military challenges, there are also other challenges, particularly right now with all the challenges of the coronavirus and all the ramifications of that. So it adds to the challenges. On the other hand, the challenges also gives birth to an interesting strategic opportunities. For example, because of the story of the Iranian threat, reminding you when we talked about the Shi'ite Crescent, and once again, let me just show you the map. Arab major states like the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, United Arab Emirates, are not less threatened by the Iranian vision. They are very much threatened by the Iranian vision. So in that sense, there is a common denominator between Israel and those states. So in sense of like strategic opportunities, that challenge also provides Israel with some very interesting strategic opportunity. And that explains, you probably are aware of the fact that recently there has been a growing rapprochement between Israel and some of those Arab states that Israel traditionally does not have a diplomatic or formal relationship. But there are many different challenges. Obviously, the security and particularly what's going around in the region is one of them. In the midst of this whole big chaos in the Middle East, Israel, in the end of the day, has to be able to portray the red lines and to be able to defend the red lines. Like, for example, what I told you, the story of the Iranian attempt to create this strangling loop around Israel's neck. Israel is strong. We have a solid base, but we have a very significant challenges, and they are not going to go away tomorrow morning.
Okay, great. Here is another question from Joshua.
Hey, Avi, amazing presentation. It was very insightful. A question about the financial implications of the Iranian activity also through proxies worldwide. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how they cooperate with drug trafficking organizations, especially in South America, or you know, general financial activities, how they're trying to launder money and get funds to the different arms of the organization.
Yes, the model of the proxies that the Mullah regime applies, in addition, of course, to the whole story of the weapons and so on, obviously has a very significant economic component. In that sense, one of the things that the Mullah regime is building is that those proxies will have an independent capacities, financially speaking, in addition to the financial support they get from the Iranians. The Iranians poured dozens of billions of dollars during the years to subsidize and build those proxies, which was a money very well spent as far as the Iranians are concerned. Only the Hezbollah alone in the good times received annually some $700 million from the Iranians. Now, in addition to that, those proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Houthis, and others, also develop an independent economic capacities. Not so surprisingly, large aspects of those activities are around criminal activities, namely mostly narcotics, smuggling, and so on and so on. There is a huge network of narcotics the Iranians are operating, and in that network you will find the Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others that are basically gaining from this network. As you mentioned before accurately, South America is one of the major stages for these activities. Remember that Iran borders one of the biggest, if not the biggest, center of narcotics exporting in the world. This is Afghanistan. And the Iranian is sitting right in this middle of this nerve junction. So yes, narcotic is one of the things that actually is significant for the operation of those proxies, particularly more and more as the Iranian regime is facing growing difficulties following the fact that the United States of America went out from the JCPOA in 2018. You may remember President Trump pulled out from the JCPOA and applied a maximum pressure sanctions on the Iranians. Those pressures, those sanctions are very biting. And obviously one of the things they cause is that they are limiting, minimizing the Iranian regime capacities to continue and to generously finance the network of the proxies around the world. There are already ramifications for that process on the ground, but yet again, those proxies continue to maintain an independent capacities. Hezbollah, in addition to the narcotics, for example, Hezbollah controls all the custom in Lebanon. Everything that goes in and out, machineries, cars, communications, and so on and so on. At the airport and so forth and so forth. So they do have these independent economic capacities.
There was another question from Carsten. Carsten, you had another question?
Yes, thank you. Avi, thanks first of all for this amazing presentation and the comprehensive summary of all the Iranian proxies in the region. So as you already commented on the ramifications of the sanctions of the US after breaking with the JCPOA, as you know, Europe still stays with the JCPOA and is hoping to reach politically compromises here. So, but what is your opinion? Is JCPOA or whatever may come out of it after renegotiating it really worth it, or is the US way of just introducing new and more and even stronger sanctions on Iran the better way in order to secure Israel's existence to this point?
Yes, thank you for your question. To make a long story short, the fact on the ground is that following the JCPOA, after it was signed, if the Western negotiators were expecting that the Iranians now become a rational player, that the Iranians now become stabilizing player, what happened was the totally opposite. Following the signing of the JCPOA, the Iranians boost their aggression in different parts of the Middle East. So it's very clear that in that sense, the JCPOA was totally a miss. If the idea of the JCPOA was to make the Iranians stabilizing factor, the totally opposite happened. But that's not only that. What also happened, that it also gave the Iranian a free card to continue to develop their missile program and to continue and develop their network of proxies and armed proxies around the Middle East. So this is one aspect. There is another aspect which is also significant. All the diplomatic efforts of the international community, and we are talking about years, to find a political and diplomatic solution vis-a-vis the issue of the Iranian nuclear issue, all of those attempts basically were totally taken advantage by the Mullah regime. Because what happened was that there were agreements signed, there were resolutions made. The Mullah regime time and again committed to fulfill its commitment, and time and again the Mullah regime basically lied and deceived. The international community time and again outreach to the Mullah regime with different gestures, and the Mullah regime reply was to further boost its aggression, further boost its destabilizing policy. The bottom line is very clear. This is a regime that does not subdue to language of diplomacy alone. If it's not painful for the regime will not change its way. The regime came to the negotiation of the JCPOA because it was under severe sanctions. That's the reason. And the regime today is experiencing a lot of challenges because of the sanctions. And those sanctions are significant because they are limiting or at least posing or holding the negative momentum of the Mullah regime in the region. I'm the last one to praise war or use of might, but it's very clear that with the Mullah regime, this is something that you have to consider seriously if you don't want to pay bigger price the next day. The facts on the ground shortly shows that, unfortunately, all the attempts to dialogue with the Mullah regime only were backfiring in the West and Israel, counterproductive to their interests.
Yeah, thank you. Kati, you have also a question?
I'm sorry, I wanted to write it down. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I just wonder, you know, you talk to us being outside of Israel, and we are, of course, we are high supporters and lovers of Israel. And we face the fact that, that Israel also has a bad image in Europe, especially, and also in Germany. And knowing what you just explained, I have to tell you, it's very complex and it's very difficult to explain to people who are not as involved as we are. So, you know, taking also into account that image is so important, I think Israel is not doing a very good job, especially now with the new plans of attack, trying to get into the new into the areas of Palestinians. I want to know, how do you take into account these broad effects in your analysis?
The broad effects when I'm talking about the reaction of the European states?
No, I'm talking about the actions of Israel in the whole picture, how we present ourselves on being one side Democrats, and on the other side being, of course, defended all the time, offended, and then also being on our side also kind of aggressive against the Palestinians. And that's really an issue, how we deal in Germany, you know, our image.
Yes.
As Israelis, I mean, taking into account that Israel is being so much under pressure, that is one part of the story, but there's also the other part, and this is something which, you know, for us being in outside of Israel, trying to defend Israel, is not easy to defend.
Yes, you are bringing a very significant point. Look, it's a very challenging, it's a big challenge. First, you have very accurately observed something which is very significant. When you say, look, I listened to your presentation for the last 45 minutes, you said, and it's very complex. This is part of the story. What do I mean? Unfortunately, the information and the way it's presented to the audience in the West, and particularly Europe, is very shallow. It's very two-dimensional. It's a lot of narratives and slogan and sound bites. This is the time and the world we live in. This is also a very challenging stage to battle, because automatically or naturally, the Palestinians are viewed as the underdog. They are viewed as the victim. I'm sure that you are familiar with the whole motions and notions around it, which for itself adds to the challenge Israel is facing. Now, I'm dealing a lot with working with foreign audience of all kinds, all sorts, you know, policymakers, students, diplomats, Jewish communities, non-Jewish, and so on and so forth. My guiding concept, and this is a concept that has been proven to be very effective when you are trying to explain the situation on the ground, my guiding line is kind of like a little bit counterintuitive. Most of Israeli speakers and organizations will come from the place of Israel advocacy. I'm not coming from the place of Israel advocacy because I don't think that in that sense, Israel really stands a chance. Let me be very clear with you. Mm-hmm. You don't fight narratives with narratives because Israel loses that ground. Israel stands no chance. You know that. You see that in Europe, you see that elsewhere. What can be done in order to convey the picture in a way that people that are listening to me or exposed to my presentation, I don't expect people to walk away with Israeli flags and say, rah, 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 Israel is the best thing in the world. That's not the story. What I do hope, and that's what happens, and you just gave a great example, I do hope that people will walk away and say, it's complicated. It's not black and white. It's not this very narrow, shallow world that we are exposed to in the European discussion, sort of speaking, quote unquote, yes? Or the US. So what I'm doing is I'm providing exactly something similar to what we did today. What we did today is a taste, meaning I am talking about the region because I'm always saying if you want to understand Israel, you have to understand the neighborhood. And what I'm doing is I'm providing this context, this framing, these ins and outs, so people will see the complexity of the picture. I'm not coming from a place that basically tries to sell Israel. I'm coming from a place where I'm explaining to people about the complexity of the region, and the advantage of that is double advantage. One, people don't feel they have to push back on me because I'm an Israel advocacy. They don't, because I'm not an Israel advocacy. People look at me and say, oh, this guy is valuable because he brings me information that I'm not aware of. It's professional. This is one advantage. And the other advantage is once people are exposed to the complex picture of the neighborhood, they are in a position that they could say, look, I may have criticism on Israel, which could be very legitimate. But at the same time, I can understand the needs. I can understand the circumstances that Israel operates in. I could be more receptive to what Israel has to say. Not to say necessarily that I will agree with everything, but I will be more receptive to what Israel has to say. I've been leading in the United States a program that is called Inside the Middle East, Intelligence Perspectives. I've been doing that for the last 7 or 8 years. I've been working with students coming from liberal arts campuses. I've been working with senior assistants and advisors of congressmen in the United States, Democrats and Republicans. And this is the exact line I'm keeping all the time. I'm providing the background, the knowledge. I'm expanding the knowledge. I've never ever come across a situation, and believe me, I give hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of briefings abroad and in Israel as well. I never come across a situation where people push back on me. I never come across a situation where people start arguing with me, because they don't argue. I'm not coming to argue. I'm coming to enrich their outlook, and people are very thankful for that. This is how you have, based upon my practical experience. Again, it's not a theory. This is something I've been doing for the last 10 to 15 years. And it works. It works. The fact that I'm being asked by campuses, students' missions, some of them are coming from campuses in the West that are very not friendly to Israel. Yet they are coming to Israel to learn, and they are asking to get together with me to hear briefings about Gaza, about Syria, about Iran. The reason they are doing that is not because I'm echoing their narratives, or not because I'm echoing the Israeli narratives. It's because they value what I bring to the table as something that is important for them. I'm expanding their knowledge, I'm expanding their outlook, and one of the outcomes of that, as I said before, is those people that are coming with some very harsh criticism on Israel. Sometimes it's not baseless criticism, but those people that are coming with these harsh criticisms are walking away, and something is changing the way they look at Israel. It's not that they are becoming pro-Israel, that's not the idea, but they are saying, now that we understand the complexity on the ground, we can allow ourselves to be more receptive to what Israel says. This is something very significant. This is how you make a change, a shift. This is how you move the needle. And this is what I'm doing. And this is, I think, the right way to approach. And again, I must emphasize that what I'm telling you is not a theory. It's based upon years and years of my work and proven experience.
All right. Thank you very much.
I think somebody was...
Shoshi, you're back.
Sorry, my daughter has the prom right now, and she's leaving, so I had to say goodbye. But yeah, thanks so much. I was wondering if somebody else has a question. If not, I really want to thank you, and I want to share quick the screen for, yeah, I want to show you again the account information. Okay. This, we showed it in the beginning. If you feel free to donate whatever you feel like. For WIZO, we are doing a fundraiser for Safety Net. This is the account information. And yeah, and Avi, it was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And, yeah, I wish I could hug and kiss you all, but so I send my love from Tel Aviv, from my home, and I hope to see you all soon again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the stage. And I hope that it was meaningful and educational. And again, as always, I'll be very happy to continue and develop a great, fruitful cooperation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Hi, everybody.
Bye, girls.
Bye, Galit. Hi.
Bye. Thank you, Shoshi.
Good night.
So much, Galit. Really.
You're welcome.
Hi, Esther.
Bye.
Bye, Nicole. Bye, Diana, Debbie. Hi, Jenny.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Oli, Riva.
Bye, Shoshi.